3 days after my father's funeral, my husband Daniel came home carrying a cardboard box from his office. He placed it on the kitchen counter and calmly announced, I quit today. I stared at him, thinking I'd heard him wrong. Daniel had worked at the same engineering company for almost 11 years. He had always complained about his boss, but he had never once talked about leaving. Why now? I asked. He smiled strangely and said, because you don't need to worry about money anymore. My stomach tightened. What does that mean? Daniel leaned back in his chair. Your father left you enough to take care of both of us. I hadn't even opened my father's will yet. My father, Richard Hale, had been a private man who rarely discussed money with anyone, including me. I knew he owned several properties and had investments, but I had no idea what they were worth. Daniel, however, seemed to know much more than I did. That night he started making plans. He said his mother needed a better house, his younger sister needed help paying her debts, and we should finally buy the expensive lake property Daniel had always wanted. I listened silently as he divided an inheritance he hadn't even seen. The next morning, Daniel asked me when the estate attorney would release the money. I told him I didn't know. He frowned. Your father promised you, didn't he? That sentence stopped me cold. What promise? Daniel immediately changed his expression. Nothing. I just assumed he had discussed it with you. But my father had never mentioned any amount of money. And suddenly, I remembered something strange from the week before his death. Dad had looked directly at Daniel during dinner and said, some things belong exactly where I leave them. At the time, I thought it was just another one of his cryptic comments. 2 days later, Daniel's mother arrived at our house with her daughter. They didn't come to comfort me. They came with a list. His mother wanted a four-bedroom house. His sister wanted $200,000 to start a business. Daniel had already promised them both that I would help. When I confronted him, he didn't even apologize. We're family, he said. Your father would want you to share. I looked at him and asked, did my father ever tell you that? Daniel went silent for 3 seconds too long. Then he walked away. That evening, I opened my father's old desk for the first time since his funeral. Inside, I found folders containing property records, bank statements, insurance documents, and handwritten notes. But one folder was missing. Its label had been torn off, leaving only a small strip of blue paper. Beneath the empty space was an envelope with my name written in my father's handwriting. My hands began shaking before I even opened it. Inside was a single sentence. If Daniel asks about the inheritance, do not tell him anything until you speak with Martin. Martin was my father's estate attorney. I had met him only once years earlier. I immediately called his office, but his assistant said he was unavailable. Before I could leave a message, my phone rang. It was Daniel. He asked where I was. I told him I was at my father's house. His voice suddenly became sharp. Why are you going through his things? I asked him how he knew what I was doing. There was a long silence. Then he said, because I know your father left instructions. My blood ran cold. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2:13 a.m., I heard the front door open. Daniel had told me he was going to bed hours earlier. I quietly stepped into the hallway and saw him standing in the living room holding my father's old briefcase. What are you doing? I asked. He froze. The briefcase fell from his hand. Daniel looked terrified for the first time since my father's death. He whispered, you don't understand what your father did. Before I could ask another question, he grabbed his coat and left. The following afternoon, Martin finally called me. His first words were, are you alone? I said yes. He told me to lock every door before continuing. Then he asked whether Daniel had mentioned a specific amount of money. I told him about the $200,000 promised to Daniel's sister. Martin became silent. That's interesting, he finally said. Because your father left no cash gift to Daniel, his mother, or his sister. I felt a wave of relief. Then Martin added, but there is something much more serious you need to know. Martin explained that my father's estate contained a private trust. I was the beneficiary. But the trust wasn't simply a pile of money. It contained properties, investments, and ownership interests in several companies. More importantly, my father had placed conditions on access to some of the assets. One condition required me to remain married to Daniel for 12 months after my father's death before certain funds could be transferred. Daniel couldn't possibly have known about that condition unless someone had told him. I asked Martin the question that had been haunting me. Who knew about the trust? He answered carefully. Your father, me, the trustee, and one other person. I asked who. Martin refused to say over the phone. Instead, he told me to come to his office the next morning. Before hanging up, he said something that made my heart stop. Your father believed someone close to you was trying to gain access to the estate before his death. At Martin's office, he showed me a document signed by my father 6 weeks before he died. It contained a handwritten note attached to the bottom. If I die unexpectedly, investigate the financial activity of my son-in-law. I stared at Daniel's name printed beneath it. Martin then showed me bank records. Over the previous 8 months, Daniel had quietly transferred small amounts of money from our joint account into an account I had never seen. The amounts were never large enough to trigger my attention, but together they totaled nearly $47,000. Then came the part I never expected. Martin told me my father had hired a private investigator before his death. The investigator had discovered that Daniel had been communicating with someone who claimed to be a financial consultant. That person had been asking Daniel detailed questions about my father's assets, properties, and estate plans, but the investigator had never been able to determine why. Martin handed me a photograph. I recognized the woman standing beside Daniel immediately. She was Daniel's sister's business partner. I confronted Daniel that evening. I didn't mention Martin or the documents. I simply asked, "How much did you know about my father's estate before he died?" Daniel's face changed instantly. He tried to laugh, but it sounded forced. Then he said, "Your father told me everything." I asked him what exactly my father had told him. Daniel couldn't answer. I watched the confidence disappear from his face. Finally, he whispered, "I was trying to protect us." I asked, "From what?" He looked toward the door and said, "You have no idea who your father was protecting you from." Before I could respond, someone knocked on the door. Daniel went completely pale. I walked toward it, but he grabbed my arm. "Don't open it." Another knock came. Then my phone rang. It was Martin. He told me not to let anyone inside and said the police were already on their way. I asked him what was happening. His answer was almost a whisper. "We found the missing folder from your father's desk." I asked where it was. Martin said it was in Daniel's office. The police arrived minutes later, but Daniel had disappeared through the back door. His car was still outside. His phone was on the kitchen table. Inside his cardboard office box, investigators found copies of my father's property records, photographs of the estate, and a key to a storage facility I had never heard of. At the storage unit, they found something even more shocking: documents proving that someone had been preparing to sell one of my father's properties before the estate was legally transferred to me. Weeks later, I finally understood why my father had been so careful. Daniel hadn't quit his job because he believed my inheritance would make our lives easier. He had quit because he believed he had already figured out how to control it. But he had missed one detail. My father had anticipated his greed. The trust protected the assets, the evidence exposed the secret transfers, and the mysterious storage unit revealed the plan before it could be completed. Daniel eventually faced a criminal investigation while I filed for divorce, and every time I think about my father's final warning, one sentence still echoes in my mind: "Some things belong exactly where I leave them." Now I finally understand what he meant.